Because I had been struggling with exactly this question of saying that, what happens when people start viewing art, right? So somewhere what we're trying to say is that, there's one thing, which is that artists make work, and then, there is a whole bunch of art, historical work. So I don't have to know you to be a part of the same kind of thoughts. Also going back to this question about how art history intersects with various things, I find it very interesting to think that these images of power become things that very much that we need to be aware of, or that, we consume them whether we like it or not.
Do keep giving your love and support. Do subscribe the channel. Don't forget to press the bell icon for getting the further updates. Since you're mentioning, let's talk about museums now, and you've had a lot of research in that area. Give us a few idea about what kind of research you did. Like I read up something on 2 museums that you did in Awadh and Banaras, and how it came about. And also wanted to, in going forward, discuss the role of museum, how we would like to,
So one of the things, of course, so I was interested in museums, as I said, Lubna, which is because of the fact that I thought that, they were the sort of places one could just go into and learn so much about, everything about the past, about, culture, and so on. So for me, the interest, and as I came into into my program, and I started really thinking about this question of art museums specifically, and somehow everybody in the world seemed to have like these, museums of contemporary art and museum of art. And then so it really got me thinking, saying, which are our museums of art? And at that point of time, remember that there was a lot of conversation about, this great museums of contemporary art that were to be made. The kind of place that I worked in was not a museum, but it was a foundation. It was a non-profit foundation, and it worked. But the sort of cyclical, the sort of duration of the exhibitions was meant to be something that really provoked a long-term conversation. That was at least the intent at that point of time. And so all of these things really got me thinking about where are we locating, or where are our art museums? So should we think of them as being located within the galleries of the National Museum? But what happens to the specific category that is the art museum? And in chasing this, I ended up finding, or locating these 2 examples that to me were very interesting in their insistence that they are actually art museums. And this is happening pre-independence, right? So we're looking at the 1920s and the 1930s, and wherein there is a very specific intent in saying that this is an art museum.
Not an archaeological
Not
museum,
necessarily archaeological, exactly.
It's an art museum.
Right, and what it taps into is this distinction between artifact and art. And as we know that, all through the colonial period, we were, what we heard was that India has a great craft tradition, but fine arts are quite missing. That was often
that was the narrative.
That was the narrative that we received, right? And we, of course, know that much of our art history today is very much an attempt to, in fact, respond to that. Was at least for a very long time, it was a response to exactly this kind of a, indictment, sort of, to say. And so what was important to me with these museums was exactly this question of this insistence. And then I started looking into their histories. And of course, what we realized is that with the category of art, again, to go back to this question of the work of art and what it does, it's that in insisting on that, we're making also a civilizational point. We are saying that this is not, we're not only the civilization that makes you pot shirts that you will tell us are dated to so-and-so, and they go back like 3,000 years. That's not only the thing that we're interested in. We're interested in taking charge of this category of, what is seemingly a Western category, and engaging with it and showing you and populating it with these choice examples. And to me, that was what was very fascinating about these 2 museums. So one being the Kala Bhavan, which is part of what we call the Banaras Hindu University, and started by Rai Krishnadas. And the other museum, which is really very little known, is of course the one in Aundh, which is really off the map, so to speak, of especially of museums. Aundh, which is in Maharashtra. So it's close to Satara.
So these are both private museums started by private enterprise?
So they get started, yes. They get started as, of course, they get started by these individuals. So whether it's Rai Krishna Das, who's a well-known connoisseur, he keeps talking about this also in his own versions, wherein he'd say, I just could not let that object go. And he's a connoisseur in that sense. But he's also very interested and dedicated to this question of, assembling a collection that is able to answer back to this great canon that exists of the works of Western art. So if we had to put a canon together of Indian art, how does
Parallel
one
to
do
it
that?
or countering it. Yeah.
Countering it, exactly, thank you. So if we had to do that, then how does one go about doing it? So that was a lot of the
That was
interest.
the
So that was so it was of course a private endeavor, but again we know that there was a lot of, looking for funds, and both these figures that I do talk about, that they do struggle at some point of time to look for funds, and because the Pant Pratinidhi of Aundh, who started the Aundh Museum, he's technically a ruler of that of that state of Aundh, but we know that it was quite a small state, very small in this in Maharashtra, and while it had a lot of prestige for different reasons and because of his patronage, and that's the interesting thing, that what is it that patronage allows you to do at a time when you're actually very, very constricted politically. So as a ruler, I may have very limited powers. Political powers. Right. But what he also does is, his son, they consult Gandhi, and he comes up with what he calls the Aundh experiment, wherein he sort of says, I'm giving away my power to my people.
Okay.
And that's a fascinating move, because you think that that was not his power, because he was under the British overlordship.
Right.
And so in that sense, he's giving away in excess of what he has. And so something like that declarative
the museum was
act,
his way of giving away the power.
no, the Aundh experiment was separate.
Okay,
and
that's separate.
But they're very closely aligned.
Okay.
They come together. And my interest was in fact in reading, saying that, because there is something to be said about saying that we have an art museum. Yeah, and nations have art museums often. Nations or regions which believe that they have a strong cultural sort of background, they are the ones who insist on having an art museum. And in creating these, I think that there was a sort of attempt at making a statement about what they have. Yeah.
And what we are as a nation.
Sure.
But also
for a nation to come at that.
Yeah. Also, the question that's coming in my mind is that you mentioned that art, the way we define art today, and we define art later. What used to be sculptures in a temple is now an art object in a museum. So when you say an art museum, one extreme question is, aren't all museums in India art museums, because there are all these beautiful artifacts which are consumed as pieces of art today. And as against that, should there be this distinction between a museum and museum dedicated to art? It seems like museum dedicated to art seems in the mind a contemporary exercise of keeping the art culture, what is there right now being produced, and or the last 100 years or something.
Right.
But what is there in the Mohenjo-daro artifacts that also could be used as art? So we sometimes look at them as art, sometimes look at them as just artifacts. So a lot of these terminologies in a normal common people's mind.
Sure. Let me just clarify. So maybe an example helps, because if you think of the fact that, let's say, museums have certain collections of objects. Now, very often you mentioned Indian Museum, or we can think of the museum that was set up in Baroda by Saji Rao. And if you think of these places, you'll realize that often they would have not just sections devoted or galleries devoted to what we specifically understand as art, and often they would be, very distinctly like we know that this is an easel painting and it's something that's immersed,
right? And
so that this has been put up on display and so on. But if you think that there are ethnographic sections, there are sections on, let's say, numismatics, there will be sections on anthropological sort of exhibits, let's say, right? And there are natural history, which is also, like in Bombay, you have a natural history section which is stacked on.
Separate ones.
And so in that sense, that's a different model of museum making vis-a-vis wherein you're saying that I will just show you a choice set of objects which are somehow represent something that is something that's distilled out of a civilization.
Correct.
And I think that is what is at stake with this art museum.
I think that's what you just explained it very well now. It's clear in the mind.
Because it's only when you think of it in relief that you understand that why this insistence becomes important.
That museum could have something historical, something contemporary, something futuristic, doesn't matter, but that's the
definition. And also, like you said, aesthetic evaluations is something that we do all the time.
Right.
We do this with not just with objects in museums, we do that with objects everywhere around, right? When we exercise our judgment in saying that, I prefer this piece of clothing vis-a-vis something else. Even just there, we are making so many choices where we're processing a lot of visual information, channeling that in specific ways, saying, okay, this is what works, right? And something that works for, let's say, your bedding is not going to be the same thing you necessarily want to.
You do differentiate.
Yes, exactly.
So how do you view the changing conditions of museums now that are happening in respect to India, and there is a lot of focus on museums making different kinds of museums. A lot of private museums are also coming into the picture. How do you see this in context to what you have studied so far?
Right. I think, and I'm going to sound like, I'm just complaining perhaps,
that's
but I
okay.
do find that it's important for us to not forget a very basic idea about the museum, which is that of a kind of public commitment. And when I say that, the general sense I have often is that we're increasingly being treated as some sort of consumers who need to be dazzled by screens, or who need to be given some sort of, something to lure us, maybe a beautiful museum shop, maybe a great cafe, all of which I'm totally in favor of. I'm not saying we need to get more people
Right.
into museums. So I'm really on board with that. But I think what happens is that it cannot become a site of just anodyne consumption. I would really want, and so while you're right that there are a number of museums that are coming up, it cannot be a space where everybody just comes, feels very smug about, having consumed high art or, high culture, and just leaves. Because if those
Again,
objects
it
are not,
becomes elitist
it's,
kind of
I
thing.
mean, I think it's just, no, everybody's free to do that. I'm not saying it's elitist, but everybody can do that. The point is that these museum objects are important and interesting because they have certain stories. And let's also go back to this whole biography idea. Because they have a certain past which is not necessarily tidily encapsulated in a sense of history that I might have. And so when I encounter this and I see it in the museum, that's my chance to actually say, you know what, maybe the certainty that I have, or this sort of very dogmatic understanding that I have of history, here is my chance to actually rethink that. Yeah, because that object is able to tell me that through the work that the museum does, through the work that curation will do. And if that does not happen, I usually find myself a bit impatient and, a bit critical. So while it's all fine, if it's just going to become some sort of, passive consumption, then I think that you can produce as many museums as you want. You can say that this is the biggest and here is the brightest and here we've got this, very glitzy thing. But I think it would fail in a very specific and a very important mission that museums, for a very long time, right from the 19th century, they've been trying to do this. And so while I do find that, also thinking about, if you think of the West and the East and this sort of binary, and the fact that we are struggling also, that is the other acknowledgement that I would like to also have, which is that in a number of collections, and I'm talking about government collections, right? Collections of the ASI or other kinds of museums, site museums, where we're really struggling even with basic infrastructure.
Right,
Yeah?
absolutely. And the amount of information, objects that are there,
Yes.
which are not being able to, they're not seeing the light of the day.
Right.
And also, purely, I think, resource constraint
Absolutely.
does not allow them to be kept properly.
Very much. Yes.
According to the practices of conservation. And
right.
I know, I mean,
you worked through this.
We've gone through it, and it feels really bad. So, from that angle, I guess,
yes,
any initiative is a good initiative from that
sure,
angle. If it is,
yes, and provided it's going into that. But if, like I said, if we're more interested in the spectacle that is the museum, then I feel a little more critical about, than a kind of unproblematized sort of celebration. The more the museums, the better it is. Yes, sure, everybody's free to make a museum, everybody's free to support the museums they like. Of course, one must think about that. But let's not also make them into just any other site. It cannot be the same as going to the mall and simply, looking. And here instead, you don't buy stuff, you just consume it in different ways.
Because as you were saying, museum by definition is a place for public.
Yeah, and it has a public
education,
commitment.
It's a public commitment.
Yes.
So, not just to open museums randomly to show India is shining and we are proud, but to have a long-term proper commitment strategy towards the museum and what will it do for the public.
Very much.
In that.
Very much. So because if we're going to shut down those conversations, or if they're going to be, just something very, very generic and only celebratory, then I think we're misusing in some ways, right?
Yes.
I mean, of course, one cannot be so prescriptive and say, okay, this is the correct use or not the correct use, because people consume the museum in different ways.
Right.
But it's also important as people, let's say, who are invested in the field of culture, who are very much part of, you've studied at the NMI or we are working with museums, to sort of insist saying that here is a framework that I would like to give you. And it may not be something that necessarily fits into your notion of when you came into the museum, but I hope that you will leave with a different idea of something, of a certain period in history, of a certain set of objects and what they mean, and so on.
I would like to counter it and want to discuss it.
Yeah.
two things come in my mind. First, of course, I mean, I've been a student of National Museum Institute, and I know that the museum itself has like, I mean, absolute treasures.
Absolutely.
But, you know, it is looked at as a museum, as an archaic institution. And when people are going there, that engagement, of course, it's become much better with
Yes,
years.
absolutely.
But the engagement is not enough, is what, you know, we felt, because while studying, I knew the treasure that is there, which is not visible to the public,
Sure.
even when they're doing a gallery
Sure.
round. Similarly, if you are going to the Ajanta Ellora caves, and if you're a scholar, you're looking at it in a different way. But if you're just a public, you're just taking a 5 minutes round in that cave and going away without looking at anything.
Yeah.
So the counter to what you're saying is, I feel that within our existing museums, a lot needs to be done, which the
Absolutely.
private museums are doing.
Absolutely.
Probably, you know, a little bit of learning
Right.
from there to increase for the outreach programs.
Yes.
And making it more vibrant.
Right.
More,
Yes.
what do you
So
think about
outreach,
that?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's the other sort of thing that I often think about, because, you know, again, the outreach, and very often they have children, and I'm very happy about these things happening. You're right that, you know, we need more engagement, and instead of it being seen as a dead institutions, if there are, you know, organizations, if there are institutions that are able to energize that and able to sort of do things. But what I think is also that we need a little bit of a critical eye to look at what is all of that adding to, you know, because
So that
if you're
it
going to
doesn't
have
get diluted. Yeah, that's
yeah,
what
I
you're
mean, in
saying?
the sense that, like I said, what happens to that potential of the museum, right?
Right.
And often, and to also to make the slight distinction that very often the private initiatives are in the field of, let's say, contemporary art that we largely know of.
Correct, yes.
There are, of course, smaller collections that people have been very lovingly sort of taking care of and so on. But largely it remains in this, I mean, the biggest players that we know of today are, you know, the ones who support, let's say, contemporary art. Now, and what happens to a lot of the other material that comes from, let's say, the ASI's great digs of different places, or other kinds of archaeological museums that, you know, and we sort of agglomerate them into different site museums or the National Museum and so on. And the point is that what does all of this activity, and it's frenetic these days, you're quite right in recognizing that. I mean, you'll see children sprawled on the floor, and I really love that. I love seeing that. I love seeing that, you know, there are children who are at least thinking. But then I also want to give them a little more, precisely because I'm invested in this thought that, you know, they're the ones who are going to go forward and look at, and, you know, they are the future, so to speak, right? And so then if you're going to just lead them with an understanding that you come here, you absorb what is given to you, you do exactly as is told to you, then I think we've got a problem.
I got it.
Know?
So what what I'm understanding is, as kids, don't just come here and do a painting workshop and do that painting and go away, but look at why this is built and what it means, you know, this whole
ways to combine
space.
these
Yeah,
things.
ways
You
to
know, I'm not saying
combine
that give them a history lesson and whack them on the heads with it. Yes, not what I'm saying, but to find ways where there's still like a critical faculty is exercised.
Right.
That's something I just wish for a lot more.
Absolutely.
Where it's not only about saying coming and doing a task which can be done easily at home or at school or anywhere else. So then why are we in the museum? Because
absolutely. That's why we love talking to academics like you, to give that perspective and remind us that this is something more serious. On that note, I mean, I also, I mean, the role of museum is anyway, you know, I just checked the definition. Now it's ever evolving and ever getting updated. So it is getting things like inclusivity, sustainability, and all that kind of thing. So in your experience, any museum that you would like to cite as something that you really enjoyed as museum, doing the function of a museum and the role of museum? I mean, you're happy with it?
I usually like going to all kinds of museums, even if they're in a quote-unquote bad state. So perhaps I'm not the best person to pick a favorite. But what I found interesting, and I thought this is something that came up during the pandemic, and I thought these are things that we need to absorb. You know, though I know that in India we were really struggling with coping with everything. So the museums were certainly left out of that, you know, any kind of consideration. And to expect also was perhaps a bit unfair, because people were struggling on just about every level. So to say that, you know, please come up with a cool, smart, you know, social media post, is perhaps maybe that was not the thing. But I do know that there were a lot of ways in which the pandemic actually helped museums really abroad that I'm talking about, where they really broke out into a new kind of thinking about the museum space and the sort of people who could come into museums.
Correct.
And so, for instance, you had the Uffizi Gallery, which really they really animated a lot of their works. They were very heavily on TikTok, and so they really took it all out in that sense, and managed to bring in a lot more new audiences, right? But without necessarily maybe so that fun part actually can be the starting of something. I'm just saying that we cannot end at that.
Got it. I
Right?
got it. Yeah.
And if like labels are not going to do the basic tasks of getting us to pointing out things, looking at things, getting us to look at things, then that's the gripe I have, let's say. But on the other hand, like to think about also like what this outreach can do. So something like I know that there was this black opera singer Peter Brathwaite, who ended up taking on this. The Getty Museum put out a challenge, and he took this on. Saying that you can recreate the museum, like you can take up a masterpiece and you can recreate that at home with the things that you have. And it was a roaring success because people came up with all kinds of really wonderful, hilarious, and very creative ways of responding. Yeah, and so it went on to the social media accounts of the Getty Museum, and there were a few other museums, I think, that
I think I remember that.
Yes, because it was great fun, and it was all over social media because people were really finding ways of remaking the let's say the work that they really enjoy. Now, what he did was, Peter Brathwaite, was that he took up this question of black portraiture,
right,
and started paying attention through his own interest, and he started actually recreating a lot of the portraits of a lot of black people that were in in these paintings, whether they're in this sort of a secondary role, or were there but to recreate those, and then that there's something to actually bring back a kind of a notion of being seen.
Correct.
To say that let's look at this character, let's look at this subject in history, and let me recreate that, so that you are not just trying to make this into a fun
an accessible
just a thing, but as much as
educate.
Also to educate. Thank you. And to look at these histories which are long left out of it. And while there are a lot of correctives, we know that there is a great demand for or there is a great pressure on museums, and they're taking that up in different ways on this question of decolonization,
right,
what it means to decolonize, and what does it mean that if you have so many objects that you've plundered from across the world, how does one deal with that? And a lot of the answers are not satisfactory.
No,
so I'm not going to. Yes, I'm not going to pretend.
As an Indian, you go to Victoria Albert and you enjoy the thing, but that the omission of the context really bothers you. That where from these contexts, these objects have come. So
that's true. So I'm saying that on one hand there are all of these efforts, and at the same time, if you think of here in India, I think we seem to be tying into a lot of the narratives about bigger museums, glitzier museums, high-tech museums. But I think a lot of the basics need to be taken care of. And I would really love to see that happen first. And
that's a very important point.
That there is a lot of very simple things about inventorying, or simple things about the condition in which objects are. So that would be something I think we really, now there is talk about some huge, and this is so brief and fleeting that one is concerned without having more information about some kind of storage spaces that are going to come up. And we have no idea what this is going to mean, which objects go in there, what happens to the National Museum moving. These are things we don't know enough about, but it's enough to make us wonder and be concerned. And so while there is this great interest in saying that we're going to produce the biggest museum, these are the kind of things that I really wish that these are the basics that I wish that we'd, in terms of the basics, in terms of its public commitments and critical engagement and an open-ended conversation about these objects, and as well as the more logistical, infrastructural things that we need to really be looking out for if we really care about these objects. Right?
Absolutely. I think you are saying the very relevant thing, that in the process of making museums accessible, we should not forget the origin objective of the museum is to store, take care, educate, and preserve that knowledge.
I mean, though I should say, Lubna, I just remembered a story, which is that, museums have not always been this way, in the sense that museums, meaning that we've come to learn how to be in museums, right? We all know our behaviors. We know that, we should, you don't necessarily jab objects. People do that all the time, but you don't, that you shouldn't touch objects, that you don't, knock into them, and you have to be careful, and all kinds of things. But for instance, I remember reading this very hilarious account, which was a report, and a committee was asking the keeper of the National Gallery in London about what was happening in and so this person, he's giving this testimony, and he's talking about people coming in who are essentially using that long gallery space to teach their toddler to walk, this couple who are
Right.
coming in, or that, people are setting down their lunches and, a group of schoolboys who are sitting down to have their lunch. And so these kind of stories also make us think that it is not some us and them, that, people somehow in the West have always known how to deal with museums vis-a-vis us. It's absolutely not that case. And that, there is a certain learning that is happening. I mean, of course, that there has to be an acceleration of that. In some ways, that's of course there. But to say that, that these are things that we can actually do, and that they can be spaces where people come in and really learn new things in different ways. I mean, interacting with objects being the first step, but yes. So I think that would be something to think about.
Great. So, as an art historian, maybe if I were to ask you a question, two questions. What does art mean to you?
Okay.
And also, what do you think the role of art history as of today is?
Okay. Okay. I think I'm going to take the easier one, which is the second one, which would be to say that, I think art history's relevance at a time when we live in such an image-saturated world cannot be overstated. And I say this not because I'm completely, invested in it, and it's where I, draw so much of my meaning from, but as much as because I genuinely think that, it's a world so heavily saturated with images that there has got to be a way in which that we are able to negotiate that. We are able to read this because very often we're being taken in by this without necessarily having the tools to actually discern between things. And I find that that's something therefore I find that it's very, very necessary. And because also, like I said, I like to think of art history as rooted within a larger cultural field.
Right.
And there are disagreements, without losing sight of the work of art, like I said. And that, what that means is that, and I do believe, and that's something that, you really have to know this in the sense that it's really a core belief that the sphere of culture is not something that's a reflection of something happening elsewhere. Right? It is not just a reflection that, okay, I can't just reduce it to a reflection or make it into something that is, of very little concern to everyone. Because as I started in the beginning, that it's something that all of us encounter. It's all of us are participants in it. And therefore, it makes sense to actually, and therefore to be alert to it, right? And so to me, that artistry is able to do that. It's been able to do that by taking on methods or approaches or, subfields such as visual culture, or you think of visual studies broadly, or a social history of art, or any of these methods. And I'm not saying these are the only, but in different ways to actually engage with this changing reality. Yes? And to say that, we need to really find ways to account for this plethora of, visual stimuli and material that is around us, and still have a way of being able to work through it. Yes? And to use a lot of the tools that we have within the discipline to be able to actually unpack that, to be able to read interconnections, to realize how people are, consuming and making images in very specific ways. And when I say making images, I'm not talking about artists. I'm talking about also whether it's advertising, it's different kinds of culture industry.
We are in a very visually
saturated
world, extremely.
That's right. So these are things. Yes, overstimulated, perhaps. Yes. And so, how does one step back from that? And so that I think. Therefore, I think that it has a very important connection. And that apart, like I said, if I were to think that as an art historian, it's also I'm very much invested in institutions of art, whether it's the art school, whether it is, other cultural institutions, including questions of the ones that, let's say fund artists.
Right.
Yeah. Then I think that there is so much to be said. And there is so much to be said also for the fact that what is the role, because in here, let's go a little bit into artistic practice and think that, I find it's a very compelling and it's a very large question to think, what does artistic practice and how do we expect to find it, and what can it do, and what can it be in this day and age when, like I said, that everybody's an image producer, people are making all kinds of things, but and I teach students who are aspiring artists, and I think that I sometimes worry for them in the sense that I feel that they have such a lot to deal with. Yeah?
And also maybe a lot more pressure.
A lot of pressure, absolutely. And this whole, the question of newness, and whether it's about, and how do artists respond to this world?
Yeah, how do they
artists
navigate?
Have always found ways of responding to everything around them. And the world itself is actually so chaotic at this point, and has always been in some ways, I guess. But to say that, how does one, and how do they annotate this new thing? This is the kind of concern I have for the students we teach. And but I mean, of course, they all find ways of responding to it because artists have always done so, right? And I find that fascinating. And so artistry is being interested and involved in, actually explaining, in actually making sense of, in actually, really supporting a lot of this kind of conversation as well. To say that here are artists, here are the ways in which they're responding to the world,
Right.
here are the things that they're taking on, and, let's see how we can make sense of it. And how
Perhaps
we
the
can
role
read
of
it.
an art historian is even bigger now.
I would like to believe so,
yeah,
yes.
to bring an order to the thought process of what's
Yes.
going on around.
And also to say that, let's look for it more than,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be restricted to that, to in fact say that let's give them the space to do so. And I
Yeah.
think that is where we can, we really have to think about how we can support artists in being able to do what they do. So
That's great. So what do you think about this platform, Chaibrary?
firstly, thank you. Like I said, I'm very happy to be here because I think there's a great need for firstly a kind of a platform which is able to demystify a lot of the academic work that we
Right,
do.
yes.
And I think it's important that, especially us as academics who tend to remain within the same circles, who end up having the same conversations with their peers who are also academics, and very often it becomes an inward conversation. And the role of and it becomes harder also for, there are new pressures in academics of all sorts. Everybody leads busier lives, and so within that, let's say the earlier possibilities, some of the earlier possibilities of reaching out, speaking at various kinds of public fora, I think that has gone down. At least I feel so as a younger academic, as somebody who's just about starting out in that sense. And I find that therefore that a platform like this, when I had this invitation, it feels like something really important to actually take forward these conversations on art. Yeah, and coming from a variety of perspectives. So I think I really enjoyed and value the fact that you've got practitioners, but you're also calling in academics, and you've got getting a range of people to actually, really think about this very important thing that we call art.
Right,
Yes.
absolutely. Thank you, Deepti. It's been wonderful to have you, and definitely the discussions are like opening my mind also to a lot of different ways of thinking about art, art history, museum, public spaces, and how do we look at all that, and what's our responsibility, more importantly, from the community or as just a member of the society. So it was a wonderful experience talking to you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Lubna, and thank you very much to Chaibrary for having me here. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Chaibrary. Do keep giving your love and support. Do subscribe the channel. Don't forget to press the bell icon for getting the further updates. And this is Lubna Sen from the sets of Chaibrary. Until we meet again next time, take care.